This is XTP Media.
Welcome to the first episode of the Partnership Edge, the podcast that unlocks the secrets of successful partnerships in complex ecosystems. I'm Peter Johnson from XTP, and if you lead alliances in infrastructure, aerospace, defence, technology and public services, this show is for you. In each episode, we sit down with leaders who've mastered trust at scale, and we turn their hard-won lessons into strategies you can adopt straight away. Today, for our launch episode, I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Stuart Cairns, partner and co-head of Bird & Bird's Infrastructure, Projects and Procurement Group. Stuart and the Bird & Bird team generously supported the launch of our white paper, Trusted Partnerships, Unlocking the Value in Strategic Alliances. In the next 20-25 minutes or so, we're going to explore exactly why 96% of strategic partnerships say trust is critical, but so many are still transactional and creaking. We'll dive into the trust clock, the 6 trust behaviours, the balance of fairness, the balance of power, and the practical 3-point trust manifesto that turns ordinary contracts into extraordinary alliances. Stuart, welcome to the Partnership Edge.
Hi, Peter. Good to see you.
Thanks very much for joining us. Listen, Stuart, you sit right in the middle of complex public and private sector alliances. What really first convinced you that trust isn't just a nice to have and is one of those performance multipliers?
It's a great question, Peter. I think it was pretty clear when we started to see relationships fall apart or processes failing to deliver the right outcomes for the clients. So to me, trust from the earliest opportunity informs success.
Yeah.
And, if a bidder can't trust its prospective customer, and if the customer doesn't trust its suppliers, then where do you go? How can you be certain that anyone really understands the other and can deliver on what they're being asked to respond to?
We'll come back to how, the expertise of you and the business bake that in, but you obviously have to build a relationship with that client as well, and they have to rely very heavily on the expertise that you'll bring to the relationship. How do you go about making those clients feel comfortable and confident that Stuart and Bird & Bird are going to be a trusted partner?
Well, I think firstly trying to get some time with them early in the process. We have been parachuted in late on processes, and it's really hard to build trust in that environment. I think if you can get engaged early, ideally get some face-to-face time in the room, I think that makes a massive difference. These sorts of procurements tend to take quite a while. We're not talking about something that happens in a short number of weeks. They're usually a number of months or years. And therefore, that means everyone's going to be spending quite a bit of time together. And it's good to just build that rapport, build that relationship. And in the same way, I encourage clients to try and build rapport through procurements with their bidders. That's exactly what I think is valuable. So having the chat over a cup of coffee and find out what's going on outside of work, what's going to happen at the weekend, just a little bit of more general, relaxed conversation, I think helps people get to know each other, helps show that it's not just about, the job or invoicing or anything else. It's actually about trying to do a good job and understand properly what's important to the client. I think it's really valuable. And I want my clients to enjoy working with me and my team. I want them to actually look forward to engaging and meeting up and actually just drive that through the entirety of the process and everyone they engage with.
And when we were, I know you were quite close to me when I was doing a lot of the research for the white paper. One of the things that came out in that relationship development phase was the use of technology and, of course, AI and how that affects things. One of the key messages we found in the LinkedIn report was that although AI is an enabler to help harvest large amounts of data, it was the expertise that started the process of building the trust. How do you, in the relationship you just talked about building with your clients, how do you go about convincing them that technically you've got that capability and that capacity to support them in the right way? Because that's really where this starts.
Well, I think there's nothing better than others advocating for you. I think I'm a pretty modest guy, and actually it's harder to talk about why you're very good at something and why you're the right person for the job. Whereas if another client comes to their peer and says, look, Bird and Bird will do a good job for you, or they know what they're doing, they're very practical, they're very pragmatic, they're very commercial. That's what we want, and I think it's a really powerful thing. And actually, in our world, we're very lucky that often even the bidders come to our public sector clients and say, we take comfort, we have confidence in processes that are supported by that team, because we know they'll be well thought through. We know that there'll be good engagement at the right time about the right things. And also, possibly most important, they'll be respectful of time and cost, because it's a very expensive business bidding for public sector opportunities, and the process can get ahead of itself, or it can take on a life of its own. And you'll know that from your engagements, that if you end up talking about everything, or if you end up engaging around everything, then the cost just racks up, and that just increases risks. Increases the risk, and definitely doesn't drive a better outcome.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about some of those failures in the process at the moment. The white paper and the survey of the 48 strategic partnerships found that almost everyone, 96%, said trust is critical to success. But what we also found was that almost half, 44%, reported limited openness. From the buyer side, and you advise clients every day, what are the most common traps that destroy trust before the ink's even dry on the deal?
I think the thing that undermines all of this is it's quite easy to say you're looking for a trusted relationship. It's quite easy to say partnership, collaboration, good engagement, openness, transparency are fundamental. It's really easy to say that. And in many respects, we see it appearing as a theme in almost every major project. But it's not enough to just say it, is it? So, you need to know it and live it, and actually make sure it's core to everything that you do. So it's not a soundbite. It should be an absolute commitment to be open, to be engaged, to be transparent. And actually, every decision that's taken on that buy side should be in the context of, is this transparent? Is this open? Is this likely to build trust or undermine trust? Because if you say one thing and do another, that's when the trust goes, isn't it? If the process is meant to be really open and looking for a collaborative partner, and then either the procurement methodology or the form of contract, or even the technical specification, obviously less our world, but if any of those fly in the face of it, then how can there be trust? You need them all to embrace it, support it, and actually enable the partner to actually behave in a partnership way.
Now, you talked about building relationships for yourself, and of course there's a key aspect of the white paper is this trust clock, and that organisational trust doesn't start to build for 2 to 3 years in some instances. Not my research, the experts at Strathclyde University helped me out with that. It feels sort of right. And it feels like the right sort of time. But as a procurement lawyer who, you run early market engagement on multi-million, billion-pound infrastructure projects, not only in the UK but across the world, how can buyers and suppliers start building that trust early without tripping over the procurement rules and risking legal challenge. We see that threat of, if you're going to engage with the market, you have to do it in a way that doesn't shut the door on that risk to challenge.
Yeah. Well, look, anyone who knows me well knows how committed I am to market engagement. I absolutely believe it's key to getting good outcomes. If your market doesn't know about the opportunity, obviously, if they don't know what you're trying to do through that opportunity, and if you don't engage with them early and take the chance to test the approach, then I think you miss out on a really obvious opportunity to inform the longer term success. Certainly from a UK perspective, there is nothing, and EU perspective, there's nothing in procurement law that prevents it. In fact, it's now clear that it's encouraged, which is a fantastic development because, for all the reasons I just said. So as long as you, apply a process or an approach that treats everyone equally, broadly speaking, that is open and transparent and non-discriminatory, then you can absolutely do this without tripping up. I do see organisations who are really reticent to do it, and they're worried that they might say the wrong thing, or they might, do something which undermines the integrity of the process. If I'm faced with that situation, I just invite them to relax a bit, make the most of the opportunity, try and be as fair and as even-handed to everyone as they can, and certainly in my experience, doing this for 25 years now, organisations in the private sector are not looking to trip the public sector up. They're not looking to try and find reasons to criticise. And I can't remember many occasions where the private sector has said, "Oh, we don't want to engage with our customers," or "That's a waste of time or effort." I think 9 times out of 10, if not 99 times out of 100, they'll say, "This is great. We want the client who'll listen to us. We want the client who's willing to just devote the sort of attention to us that we're willing to devote to them to try and win this opportunity." And I just always encourage it, and I can't remember the last project where we didn't do any market engagement.
Okay. Couple of questions spring to mind there, Stuart. The first one is there any sector specific difficulties? When we were having a chat over the launch and talking to Jeremy Hollard about the defence sector, challenges there can be quite intense and significant because of the size of the contracts. Are there any sectors where litigation and challenge is more frequent than others, or is it more down to get that process right?
I'd say there's definitely sectors which are more likely to have challenges arising. I, so far as I can see, it's never to do with the nature or extent of the pre-market engagement, and more to do with the market itself. So, for example, if there aren't many bidders, or if there's too many bidders, both of those things can be problematic. If there aren't enough contracts coming to market, or if there's too many, again. So, to answer your question, I think if you get the process right, then you give yourself the best chance to avoid challenge. If you build trust, in my experience, bidders don't tend to challenge when they trust the organisation that's been running a process. It tends to be a build-up of things that, a perception that they were never going to be able to win something, or that they've been treated unfairly. So that trust is a very valuable thing in terms of mitigating risk as well.
So, it's no surprise a couple of years ago I sat on the other side of the table from a process that you folks were running. And one of the things that struck me is never closing the door to coming back to us. As a client, having that opportunity, we were quite, as a private sector bidder, we were quite nervous of, well, why would they leave the door open? Should we, shouldn't we? But it was unique. And what it meant is it built confidence to us that there was never a time when we couldn't approach you or the client directly and say, "Look, I've discovered this," or "Have you thought of that?" Now, to my knowledge, most of the contractors didn't use that, which is a shame, really, because it's a great opportunity to continue to build your credentials. But what are the technical areas of how you have to close a door or not? Because it just felt very open to me right the way up until the notice came out, and then in reality the door closed. But before that, what are the technical challenges that you have as an advisor to keeping that door open?
Well, I think you're right. It sort of closes at the formal commencement of the process for obvious reasons. But I think up until then, provided you make those opportunities available to all, provided you have a good audit of what's going on and when and why, and provided the quality and nature of the information that's being shared is consistent, so you're not giving anyone an unfair advantage, then I personally think that it is good practice to engage extensively with your marketplace in whatever way makes sense. There in the sector we're talking about there, which we should say is highways, there are a lot of opportunities coming out. So sometimes we say that it's a highly competitive market, and that means there are too many bidders and not enough clients. I think in that marketplace, there's actually a lot of clients and possibly not enough bidders. So, our approach is to say to our clients, you want to stand out in this marketplace. You need to accept that there are a number of opportunities likely to come out within a period of time that a good bidder will be looking at and try and decide which of these will I focus my attention on. And therefore, I think it is good to sort of demonstrate that you are a client of choice, that you are the client that deserves to get the best bidders, or possibly even the best people within the best bidders. Because, often there are bidders, but whether it's the focus of the bidders organization or not, sometimes only plays out midway through a procurement. So to get the interest of those right organizations and to show them the respect I think they deserve when you ask them to spend hundreds of thousands of pounds trying to win an opportunity, I think the right thing to do is to give them good engagement around good information to allow them to make the right decision, which is ultimately to respond to the formal notice and try with all they can to give the very best bid for the project.
Yeah. Interesting. It did pan out that way. And, as is known, I was unsuccessful with my organisation, but I always felt the answer was fair as a result.
Yeah.
There was never a reason not to feel other than disappointed in ourselves for our inability to satisfy the bid, that the process hadn't taken care of fairness.
And that's exactly it. And, we sit on the other side quite a bit as well, where we support bidders. And it is hugely frustrating when you ask a question, either pre-procurement or actually more importantly within a procurement, and you don't get an answer to it. And there's no good reason. It's like, something really, and you're not even asking it. Of course, you can ask questions just for yourself or for the market generally. But if you ask a question and say, look, we think bidders would benefit by understanding better what you mean by this, and you don't get an answer.
Yeah.
Like, that's just a barrier to better proposals, and that's frustrating. Our view almost always is, if a good question comes in or a reasonable question comes in, we'll give a good answer to it because it's going to help bidders give better responses.
Yeah, interesting. Let's go on to getting the most out of the contracts and the advice you give to clients. I came up with the 6 trust behaviours, as it were. The sorts of things we expect, but we also came up with some terms which really distilled my focus through listening to the group of lawyers you had at the event last year, 40 or 50 lawyers in the room, giving advice to people like me on the do's and don'ts. And I came up with the balance of fairness in the relationship, making sure risk is in the right place, and that it isn't unfairly governed. But also this term, the balance of power as well. Clients use contracts often to beat the contractor up, but then the contractor in return can often use the contract to create claims. And that great story of the pile of stones, the American litigation lawyer used in that presentation, where one claim is a stone, it's okay, you can pick it up, you can deal with it, you can move it from A to B. But when you've got a pile of stones, in effect, you're recognising you've got a big problem. and that's when you call in people like him in, and that's when the end of the partnership and all the trust breaks down. See, but you've advised on everything from highways, utilities to airports, have to come back to that sometime, transport products and projects. Can you talk us through a deal where deliberately baking in those sorts of behaviours delivered the sorts of results that we talk about in the white paper?
Yeah, look, I like to think that nearly all those projects that we worked on, we try and drive to a point where the process allows the client to make a really good decision. And what I mean by that is, value for money, obviously, but also a good technical solution that demonstrates a really good understanding of what the client wants, both in terms of core service, but also the other things that are important around, things like sustainability, collaboration, partnership, all the rest. So, one of the airports projects that we worked on, it was core. It was really important that the bidder understood that the client wanted a genuine partnership. This was likely to be a 20 to 30 year deal. Therefore, relationships were key. The quality of the core team was absolutely fundamental, but also it was also equally important that the sub-consultants that would inevitably support that core team had to be really good. And the client was interested to know that those sub-consultants were from the local area or were contributing to the legacy of this very big investment. So we talk a lot about golden threads, Peter. The golden thread is not necessarily just getting a good core service or a good solution. It's actually all those other things, that are important. And that thread needs to be thought about really easily. It needs to weave through every decision of the process, but it also needs to find its way into the contract because, and you know this from your world, that you can write a bid, and it can promise the world, but if it doesn't find its way into the contract, and actually if that contract's not managed, and the successful contractor isn't asked to deliver on those things, then where's the value in that? Yeah. So all those things need to be picked up, and I see this as sort of a puzzle that needs put together. You need the right intent and the right understanding from the client. You need good documentation that supports that intent, whether that be procurement documentation or contractual documentation, and then you need the right attitude when the contract's in place. And there's no benefit to me, I think, in putting in place a contract that doesn't put risk with the right partner. Yeah. To take up, it was Dennis Circus, I think, was probably the American lawyer who came up with that Stones analogy. Yeah, it sounds just like him, but that's right. What benefit is there if you get a cheap price, but you spend every day fighting over what is and is not in scope? So we run in parallel with the procurement process. We run an exercise that allows bidders to look at the contract, comment on it, and we try to get to a point where it's pretty much an agreed document on largely the same basis across all bidders. Then everyone prices the same thing. Yeah. Everyone prepares their final technical solution on the same basis, and bidders can be confident that the customer is comparing like for like. And hopefully the customer can be confident that all bidders are giving them a really good proposal that covers everything that's needed, and that actually once in contract, they won't spend their time fighting with them. They'll be more instead looking at the fantastic outcomes and outputs that have emerged through the contract, because the risk sits in the right place and the level of understanding is really strong between everyone.
It's sometimes it feels so true to be as open and honest about things like that, but sometimes contracts and processes swallow and destroy some of that. But listen, let's start to wrap things up. You very kindly signed my partnership charter, so I'm beholden to working with you in that way. We talk about consistency, transparency, and fair accountability. Just wrapping up, Stuart, for the leaders listening who want that partnership edge today, what one or two actions would you urge them to take in the coming month or two? Whether they're a buyer or a supplier, to start turning ordinary contracts into extraordinary alliances.
Okay, that is a great question to finish on. I think you need to look at it in two ways. One is existing arrangements. What can you do with the contracts you already have in place, the relationships you already have? That's obviously a little bit harder because you've already, committed to a form of agreement, which may be difficult to step back from. But I don't think it's completely impossible. And even just a change of behaviour and a focus on better communication and good engagement around how the project or the contract can be delivered better will see a change, I think. And, again, I don't think many suppliers would be against that sort of thing. Who wants to fight with their customers? Yeah. I can't believe anyone wants to do that. In terms of new opportunities, I think it's about giving yourself the time to think about this. Often you end up in probably a suboptimal arrangement because you haven't given yourself enough time to think at the outset about what's important to me. Yeah. What sort of partner am I looking for? How can I encourage them and support them in behaving better? And all the things we've talked about, Peter, in the last few minutes around better documentation, a fair contract, good engagement will inform that. So that the thing I would say to anyone looking to something new is give yourself time to think about it. Really be clear with yourself and your teams as to what's important and make it core to everything you do from there on in, whether that is communication or whether it is transparency or whether it is fairness or ideally all of those things. Then make a plan for that and embed it in your decisions from the outset. And I think you'll get a better outcome.
Stuart, that's really, really insightful. Thanks so much for sharing your expertise and some of those real world examples. Just before I let you go, where can we find you and Bird and Bird online?
Online, twobirds.com.
Yep.
So that's our website. We're, an office in London and then 33 others, depending on where the listeners are, in 24 countries around the world. So, yeah, we're heavily engaged in the UK and far beyond.
And you travel a lot, and I think that's brings into play the expertise you bring, not only from some of the sectors we deal with in the UK, but from around the world. Just to finally wrap up, Stuart, is there anything exciting going on in and around the Bird and Bird world at the moment, internationally? I know you've always got your fingers in a pie somewhere that surprises me.
There's loads going on. It just depends. It's a big place, 3,500 people. We're really heavily engaged in the sports sector, doing some amazing work for some of the biggest names in sport. On the infrastructure side, we're heavily engaged in the Middle East, in Australia, Southeast Asia, Africa. Energy is a big focus for us. So renewables, a lot of projects in that area, particularly around emerging technologies and emerging solutions. And, nothing really, or less to do with me, probably. Technology is one of the core sectors for us. And, things like blockchain, data, AI, robotics, there's always something going on within the firm in respect of those things. So, and loads of detail about that on our website.
Well, Stuart, thanks so much for joining me today. Really appreciate your time.
No, thank you, Peter.
If you want the full playback we've been talking about today, head straight to the show notes and download the Trusted Partnerships white paper for free. It's packed with survey data, the trust clock, the 6 trust behaviours, and case studies from Wales, London Transport, Adshel, DIO, and many more. Plus the Trusted Partnership Charter. You can start using this straight away. If you're a leader who wants the partnership edge, share this episode with a colleague who's stuck in a transactional and creaking alliance. You'll thank us later. And if you need help in bringing your partnership to work to deliver the outcomes others are achieving, reach out to me. Our details are in the show notes. I work with organisations that recognise trust as a performance advantage and are ready to turn it into a repeatable capability. Huge thank you again to Stuart Cairns and the entire Bird and Bird team for supporting this white paper and today's conversation. If you enjoyed this launch episode, hit subscribe, leave a quick review, and join us next time where we'll be talking to another alliance leader who will be unlocking more trusted partnership secrets. Until then, I'm Peter Johnson. See you on the next episode of The Partnership Edge.
XTP Media.